everyone, welcome to the 30-day photo challenge April 2021 edition. My name is Elsie Kibue, and I'm a Kenyan photographer based in the UK. So for the whole month of April, I'll be sharing with you photo stories from BIPOC Women Photographers. And we have one with us now. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Nilanjana Bhattacharjya. I'm actually coming from you many hours away. It's at least 8 hours, I think, maybe difference. I'm in Arizona, in the middle of the desert, and I'm a professor at Arizona State University. So I teach college students most of the day, grade papers, and I've enjoyed taking pictures for about 5 years now. And I think a lot about the potential for photographs to make us think differently about what we see each day.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us and thank you for agreeing to do this project with me.
I have three images I will be sharing with you today. Uh, for the last couple of months, I've been realizing that I've spent many hours and many days so visiting botanical gardens around the world, and eventually I am starting to do some research on the project. I'd like to do an extended photo essay on the botanical garden. So it's a place that really it fascinates me because botanical gardens have historically been associated with colonialism and imperialism and the gathering of all sorts of plants from all over the world. And these days, trying to figure out what the botanical garden is doing is fraught with so many different questions in terms of its origins, but also more contemporary responsibilities to preserve what is out there, both locally and also, in many cases, from parts of the world that are very, very distant and very, very different in climate. So I'm particularly fascinated by the fact that people have been trying to gather plants from places and bring them back to other places where they could never survive and try to create these artificial environments for them, and trying to think about what motivated people to do such a thing and what we do with such motivations today in terms of our responsibilities to our public is something I'd like to explore in this project. So this first picture is from Acharya Jagdish Chandrabush Botanical Garden, Howrah, India, which is outside of Calcutta.
Yeah.
And that's where my family is from. This garden was established in the late 1790s, and it's not in the best shape these days, so it has some of the most extensive collection of plants from that region of the world, given how old and established it is. So I visited it a couple of years ago, and it
Mm-hmm.
was very difficult to get to, and it was amazing to see everything, but it was also very striking to see how few people even had heard of it who live in the city, and how difficult it is to actually visit. So
Yes.
uh, it's not a place that most people go. So this picture is taken in Copenhagen at the Botanical Garden there, and I often go to botanical gardens when I visit a city, just because I enjoy seeing how they're different and what different types of approaches they have to representing different parts of the world, as well as their more local regions. So the botanical gardens in Copenhagen actually have extensive greenhouses that are modeled on the Crystal Palace in England, which has an interesting history and it's an interesting association. But what I was
Mm.
really struck by was the fact that these greenhouses were just teeming, so bursting with so much life, and so much life that was not meant to be there at all. So these greenhouses are actually preserving a tropical, humid, moist environment. The minute you walk in them, you're in a different place. But if you're trying to imagine how these spaces were constructed in the 19th century and the technology available to keep these places what they were, it's an extraordinary amount of effort and expense required to try to sustain such an environment. And of course, now it's not cheap either. But for me, it's just incredibly fascinating to think about all these things. So I have another picture from Erlangen, which is from the Botanical Garden there, which is connected with the university, another sort of older 18th century garden. And this is inside one of these greenhouses. So my lens was fogging up because it was so humid within that space. And you can just see it's a completely different world. It does not look like we're in the middle of Germany. And it didn't feel as if it were in Germany. So when I visit my parents in India and I get off the plane, I'm always hit with this very different air, especially because I live in the desert where humidity is usually more than 10 to 15%. So it's a very visceral experience to be transported to this place where the air feels different. And eventually I'd like to think about how these things, how these differences are visually represented and explore that in my photo essay once I am able to travel to more places and start to look at things a bit more systematically. So I think that is all that I had to say about these photographs for now.
Have you been to the UK to visit like Kew Gardens?
I went many, many, many years ago, and I need to go again because I wasn't thinking through a camera at that point. But yeah, I've been thinking about these issues of collection and documentation for a long time in relation to museums, of course, especially, and in London, especially. You can't get away from any of these things.
No, you can't. Everywhere you turn, every museum you go in, you're like, oh, I recognize that. Like,
it's like,
it's
that
everywhere.
was acquired in a particular way. So
yeah,
it's fun to think about these things, and troubling as well, of course, to acknowledge those histories. But I see the Botanical Gardens as a place where maybe some of these histories are a little less explicit to people, and it'd be good to get people thinking about why and how we preserve plants and what we do when we do that.
At one point you mentioned how expensive it must have been when these gardens were created to preserve these plants, as well as now. But now you would think it might be cheaper because you have all this green energy coming up, like solar or wind turbine and all that, to keep the plants to survive in these environments. Don't you think?
I'm sure, no, it's much, much cheaper now. You're right. But at the same time, if we were trying to sustain these plants here where I live, the amount of water alone it would take to sustain these plants is not necessarily green, right?
Yes.
So thinking about, do we actually need to be the place to preserve these plants? Do people who live in a particular area need to know, how should they know about the plants and sort of find out about the world?
Yeah.
And before, of course, finding out about the world in times of colonialism and imperialism's height was to find out how much of the world your country owned and why your country was rich and how it was doing well and why you should support it. And now it's a little bit more complicated, I think. Yeah.
Did you find when you were visiting these spaces, especially the ones in Europe and the botanical garden like in India, the fact that the Indian one doesn't have like this glass building protecting it, and then the European ones have this glass building, and you're like, this shouldn't be here. It's confusing. And as well, this should be taken care of. It's in the right environment. Did you find those conflicting ideas running through your head when you were photographing these spaces?
I think there are differing amounts of funding available to support these gardens, especially the ones that are public. So I think that's the thing that was really going through my mind, is that the collection itself that is in Kolkata proper is magnificent. At the same time, they don't have the resources to maintain sort of, the area. I mean, it's just as simple as that. So yes, I mean, I think that the distinction in resources is key, but it's still, I mean, it's interesting what you can do and how much you can do if you work with the climate that is here. So where I live, as I said, is in the desert, but we have a desert botanical garden in here locally that I visit quite often, and it is all sort of cacti and succulents, but there are cacti and succulents from all different parts of the world that are dry, like ours, and they actually survive quite lovelily here. So it's always interesting for me to look at cacti from Madagascar or something, and know that they're not meant to be here, but they do quite well.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. It's certainly an interesting project to look at from an environmental perspective, and also from, like you said, a colonial aspect of it. And I really enjoyed looking at the pictures because I was quite intrigued, especially the ones where you see through the glass into the land outside. I would have
Yes.
loved to see that contrast of this tropical garden inside, and then outside you're just seeing snow. And you're like,
Right.
there's that difference, as in, is this meant to be here? That question, you know? Have you ever thought of visiting the space, the area, like when it's dead in winter and then you have that difference in temperature?
If I have the finances to do so, I will definitely do that. But I think the other thing is that this is a project I'm coming to and realize that I maybe was thinking about in the back of my mind in terms of this obsessive need to visit gardens wherever I went, but I hadn't been thinking about it as a project. And so I think the photographs I took were not necessarily with the project in mind, because it hadn't been formulated in my mind at all. So I think, as I said, what I'm interested in exploring and would like to revisit these places I've already been is thinking about how all these very complex relationships are visually represented. We know about the histories, and
Yes.
to some degree we know about how these gardens sort of function in terms of their local relationships presently, because there's lots of documentation there to look at, luckily. But just thinking about the different forms that these gardens take and why and how they look at how they do is the question I don't have the answer to yet. So I think that's the next stage.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I'm intrigued to see how far this project goes and how it develops. But it's really like with any project, anyway, even certainly for me, I just take pictures. I don't even know if they're going to develop into a project. I just take them. And then later on, when I'm editing, I'm like, oh, actually, the way I was taking them is a project in its own. And then I start investigating and finding out, why did I do this? Why am I photographing this? And what am I trying to say with my project? And certainly I can feel this when it comes to your botanical garden project, the pictures that you took. And like you said, you are writing a paper, you're trying to answer some of these questions, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
visually. So this is actually probably the first formal project I've envisioned, and it's not one that I immediately came to on my own. And a number of people suggested, like, you take a lot of pictures of gardens, a lot of pictures of plants and trees. Have you thought about why? And I started to put some words down thinking about these, and then I realized, I was like, oh, there's so much going on there. That is why I keep visiting, and there's so many questions that remain to be explored, and they're everywhere. So I don't have to actually go really far. Basically, any city of any size has a botanical garden.
Yes.
And it's going to be addressing these questions. So it's a financially accessible project as well.
Yeah, true. If you see a potential end, because there's some projects you see there will be no end. You just see them just continuing and continuing and continuing. But if you see a potential end with this project, do you think, how do you see it? What do you see the next stage to it? That's what I'm trying to ask. As in, do you see it like an exhibition, or would you like it to be like a published book? How do you see it ending?
It's funny. So the book itself is something I associate with people who actually know what they're doing, which I don't necessarily put myself in the same category as. But I have been thinking about publishing it as an extended essay. And because I am a scholar and I'm used to publishing in academic publications, journals and such, I've been thinking about how all of this and how writing outside of that mode relates to my career, if at all, if it should. So I'm always trying to work through these questions, but these days there are some experimental, more academically minded journals that I think might actually welcome this sort of mix of creative narrative / research / photography, and be able to work with these things on multimedia mode and in a way that is actually going to make the project work. So I think for me, I mean, exhibition, I'm just not comfortable with sort of putting myself out there, but I feel more comfortable sort of saying I'm a scholar who enjoys taking photographs and is learning from taking photographs, and I'd like to think about this sort of intellectually in terms of how I think about visual information and aesthetics, right? But also sort of weave that into a larger understanding that's more informed by research and scholarship.
I think you should publish it into a book.
I will think about that. I've had 3 of my photographs published so far. So it's a funny thing to think about myself as a photographer. So that was like one reason I was hesitating responding to your interview. I was like, oh, this makes me sort of have to define myself. I was like, I take photographs. It's going to be a big deal.
It's fine. Thank you so much, Nilanjana, for sharing your photo story with us. So I'm going to jump right to the next segment, which is a fire question round. I thought this would be a fun way to ask you quick photography related questions. Just pick whatever comes to mind. No pressure at all.
Okay.
Okay, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Fixed or telephoto lens?
Fixed.
Lightroom or Photoshop?
Lightroom.
Color or black and white?
Color.
DSLR or mirrorless?
Oof. I have 2 right now. I can't choose it, but the mirrorless is lighter, so I've been using that more often.
So which one are you going for, both or either or?
I think both. It's hard.
Yeah, I know. That was a bit hard if you've used both. And the last one, film or digital?
Digital right now, because I'm too poor to waste film. Not know what I'm doing.
I feel you on that one. Anyway, thank you so much again, Nilanjana, for sharing your amazing work with us. Please be sure to follow Please be sure to follow her. I'll leave all her details in the description bar below. Until next time, see you later. Bye.
Thank you so much, Elsie.